Today we're going to look at the absolute worst thing every single Illumination Animation Villain has done. As usual, we're going to begin with the characters with less concerning criminal records than the others. The villains with awful but forgivable deeds. And there's one villain that definitely earns the most forgivable spot, the Grinch. Really, the Grinch is barely even a villain, and that goes double for his Illumination iteration. They gave the guy a tragic backstory and everything, so by default, the Grinch is already at least sympathetic, but his worst deed is the same as always. He did, in fact, steal Christmas. If he'd just done this and immediately dipped, he'd probably be much lower, or maybe just a little lower, since these guys get really messed up. But anyway, the Grinch, less than 24 hours after he stole Whoville's Christmas, felt convicted enough to sincerely apologize and return what he stole.
I'm so very sorry.
He got struck with some good old post-villainy clarity and was rewarded with new friends and family who, surprisingly to him, loved him for who he was. The main man of Illumination himself, Felonious Gru, is up next. His worst deed is casual assault and destruction. And wow, that escalated quickly. Considering how he's become a full-on hero and a loving family man, it's sometimes hard to remember that Gru used to be a career criminal. His most evil deeds usually boiled down to having no concern for the lives of those around him, prioritizing the most memorably evil heists he could execute in order to make a name for himself. But when you think about it, Gru probably killed a lot of people over the years. Just think about the freeze ray, for instance. Remember that famous first scene in the original Despicable Me, where he freezes everyone in an ice cream shop to get to the front of the line? Yeah, we don't see him so eager to use an unfreeze ray on them. Sure, they're cartoon characters, so they're probably fine, but the fact remains that Gru originally had blatant disregard for the lives of others. Even when Gru becomes more caring, he still acts on some dangerous impulses, like blowing up that Carney's stand with a plasma ray because he conned Agnes out of her rightfully earned unicorn plush, or freezing Antonio for two-timing Marko at his father's party. Did both of these characters deserve comeuppance? Absolutely, but the fact remains that Gru pulled out Metroid Prime level weaponry to deal with inherently non-violent disputes. Gru is a good guy, but he's not a good guy you want to be on the bad side of. Up next we have the little guy who carried the Secret Life of Pets saga on his back, Snowball. Like Gru, Snowball started off as a much more sinister force than he became later on. His worst deed is gang violence, for the obvious reason that he was the leader of a gang of abandoned pets who would attack domesticated animals and humans in either self-defense or just for fun sometimes. His grudge was honestly completely understandable, but hurting others for the crime of, hold on, let me see here. Having a loving family? Yeah, no, not cool, Snowball.
That ball of fluff's got a screw loose. Let's skedaddle.
That said, we have to place him pretty low despite his violent tendencies, since they really were only due to his tragic circumstances. In the end of the first film, he's adopted by a loving little girl, and as a result, he decides to reform, becoming a legit superhero who risks his life rescuing vulnerable pets across the city, or at least trying to. Closing out this category is the chef from Migration. We were originally going to say that his worst deed was hunting down a flock of birds for revenge, which, mind you, is both extremely petty and still not good by any means. But then we remembered a little detail about this guy, most notably his treatment of Delroy. That might seem surprising since he doesn't seem to mistreat Delroy nearly as much as the other birds throughout the movie, or even his employees for that matter. But this isn't a case of the bad guy having a pet who he shows his few good attributes towards. It's a case of a maniacal chef kidnapping a rare bird, holding it captive in a cage that's just barely bigger than the bird is, and dooming it to a life of solitude and boredom, all so he can have an exotic pet. It may not be some world domination plot or anything, but depriving a bird of the freedom to fly around even a little bit is just cruel. But now is where things get really wild. We're moving into the more violent villains, the ones who have some truly terrible deeds on their records. We've got old villains and new villains and even the bears from Sing. These three are the closest Sing really gets to having any full-on villains. Yeah, Mike was kind of a jerk, but he was also desperate, and it's because of these bears' extortion. When Mike swindled them in a game of poker, he learned that these bears were a level of gangster he just wasn't ready to screw around with. The gang went as far as to threaten to eat Mike if he didn't get the money he owed them. We aren't putting them any lower on the sole basis that they were trying to get the money that Mike cheated them out of, but even taking that into consideration, to threaten someone with being eaten alive is a seriously extreme method, and it's very unlikely that Mike is their only victim. Thankfully, as of Sing Thriller, it was confirmed that Mike and his girlfriend somehow survived the bears' attacks. Now, whether they paid their debts or not is unknown, but at least these guys won't be able to threaten inhumane murder methods anymore. Sergey from The Secret Life of Pets 2 is next. This guy is honestly one of the scummiest villains in any Illumination movie, with his worst deed being endangered animal abuse. And let me tell you, this guy gets really into the animal abuse. I know that's an uncomfortable way to put it, but trust me, he warrants it. First, there's the most obvious example being his blatant abuse of the white tiger cub who he forces to either do dangerous circus tricks or be killed. Sergei manages to become even worse later on when Snowball tries to help Who out, prompting Sergei to sick wolves on him and even threaten to kill one of their pack if they fail. If it were just his abuse of Who, it would be one thing, and to be clear, it still wouldn't change his placement.
Training is going to be a lot more fun.
But the fact is that Sergei seems to somehow incorporate animal abuse into every ambition in his life. Getting run over twice might have been honestly too easy on this guy. Moving on to Sing 2, we have Jimmy Crystal, the first Illumination villain of a surprisingly large number who have attempted murder at least once. And most memorably, when he finds out Buster fired his daughter Portia, he dangles him off the roof of a building. Dude, I thought you were exaggerating. All right, well, I guess it's almost sweet that he did it for his daughter, but no, like threatening to kill a man for firing your kid, it's just not a proportional response. The worst part here is that Jimmy's crime here seems straight up reasonable compared to some of Illumination's other villains. It's time to talk about Carlos from Hop. A disgruntled and underappreciated worker, his worst deed was attempting to boil Fred and Mr. Bunny alive. Yes, Carlos's worst deed falls into a similar category of the Bear Gang from earlier. He doesn't stop at just killing his nemesis, but he insists on doing it in the most viciously brutal way he can think of. I mean, the whole chocolate candy thing sounds great to me, but the whole submerged in it while it's boiling thing, no, not so much. The thing is, even the murderous bears from Sing had the defense of legitimate grievances with Mike, who had conned them out of a significant amount of money. Mr. Bunny was Carlos's right-hand man, someone who trusted him enough to place him in a high-ranking position despite not being the main Easter animal, meaning he's even less justified, no matter how jealous of him he was. Okay, this next one was probably the hardest one to rank. Wild Knuckles' worst deed is child torture, specifically of a young felonious Gru, who he rightly thought had stolen the amulet, but was unfortunately mistaken about him actually having it on his person. Instead of getting the treasure immediately, he settles for holding Gru hostage in the hopes that his guardians would pay the medal as ransom.
You got 2 days or you are never gonna see your little boss again.
But when nobody comes to help Gru, we learn that Wild Knuckles isn't all bad. After getting to know him, he takes Gru under his wing and becomes a better father figure than either of Gru's actual parents by far. And again, he just finished torturing the kid, so that's a pretty quick turnaround. But that brings us to why he's placed so low regardless. While yes, Wild Knuckles did genuinely atone for his mistreatment of Gru, the fact that he was willing on any level to torture a child for the sake of revenge is not really excusable. Even if it was just bluffing, which I'll admit is pretty likely, he still fully thought that he was scaring someone into thinking their child was being tortured by a supervillain. He'd undoubtedly be near the bottom of our list if he weren't repentant about it almost immediately, and if he hadn't been dealt such a rough hand himself. That leads us into Wild Knuckles' former friend, the sinister 5 out of 6. Surprising nobody, their worst deed was betraying Wild Knuckles. Now, under any other circumstances, Wild Knuckles' low point would be way lower than the rest of his gang for betraying him, but we have to remember that Wild Knuckles, evil as he was, did actually atone for his misdeeds. On the other hand, the 5 were willing to drop Wild Knuckles out of a hovercraft, leaving him presumably to die, or at least be seriously injured. Considering that Wild Knuckles was the one to start the group itself, not to mention the one who got the amulet in the first place, the gang really had no logical reason to cut him loose. Even their justification of moving on to the next generation makes no sense, because, like, the nunchuck looks even older than him. What, did she bribe him to stay? Is the all-powerful amulet not a worthy bribe? If nothing else, I'll say this for them. This stunt definitely made them some seriously despicable villains right off the bat, and if you still aren't convinced that they should be lower than Wild Knuckles, remember, they were willing to let Gru be ripped in half just to make their power a little more unquestionable. Some villains went for even larger scale atrocities though. Take El Macho, for instance. This guy was a flamboyant career criminal who got his kicks committing the most comically macho crimes he could think of in Despicable Me 2. His magnum opus comes about, or at least it almost does, when he turns the minions into biological weapons. After faking his death in the manliest way possible, El Macho managed to come back from the shadows to try one more time to take over the world by turning the minions and El Macho himself into ruthless purple monsters using the PX-41 serum. How, or even if, he really planned to control them going forward is beyond me, but whatever the case, this was an act of straight up biological warfare against the world. Even worse, he didn't even bother to strap sharks and dynamite to the evil minions, proving that he's even lost his artistic authenticity. Closing out this category, we have Balthazar Brat. This guy's been a bad boy for his entire life, once upon a time as a criminal. But when Hollywood decided he'd lost his charm, Bratz decided that they lost their oxygen privileges. The result of Bratz's disillusionment with the world was a plot of attempted mass murder. To be more specific, Balthazar was going to terrorize the town with a giant robot of himself, and then follow up that act of citywide terrorism by floating the entire city into space using a gigantic bubblegum bubble. Now, in case the plan didn't give it away, let us just tell you, Balthazar Brat is definitely not mentally stable. I know, try to contain your shock at this reveal. That doesn't make his deeds any less evil though, but it at least shines a light on the more broken part of Brat. This kid was told by Hollywood to act like a villain for the entertainment of the masses, only for them to one day kick him to the curb when he stopped being cute enough. Now, he's doing pretty much all he knows how to do in order to gain affection from the people. It's not an excuse, of course, especially since he was still sound-minded enough to kidnap the girls to distract Gru from stopping him, but even so, it's worth noting that he's a broken man and not just a pure evil monster. On the other hand, this last category is for characters who have committed utterly irredeemably evil deeds. Kicking off our final 5 Illumination baddies is Scarlet Overkill, the main villain of the first Minions movie. Honestly, most of her deeds all run in the same direction. She strives on doing evil stuff and trying to top herself every time, but her worst deed has to be sentencing the Minions to torture. After taking the Minions in as her new henchmen, Scarlet immediately, albeit indirectly, threatened them with death if they failed her. When the Minions got hold of the Queen's crown, she mistakenly thought they were betraying her. But even after Bob handed over the crown, alleviating her concerns, she still sentenced them to be tortured by Hal in the dungeon for their crimes, which, again, were literally non-existent.
Prepare for torture, which I do.
This is made even worse by the fact that Scarlet treated the Minions like little kids, tucking them in, reading them a bedtime story and all that good stuff. To be willing to torture your own adoptive yellow gremlin children is bad enough, but doing it for no freaking reason? That's just a whole new level of depravity. Up next, needing absolutely no introduction, is Illumination's first truly evil villain, Vector. Sure, he might be amicable enough when interacting with his fellow villains, but don't be fooled. Vector is willing to use anyone and everyone he can get his hands on to act out his evil plans. Most infamously, he held Gru's girls hostage as ransom and lied about returning them. Vector might have mercifully been placed in the previous category if he'd stayed true to his word, returning Gru's girls in exchange for Gru returning the shrunken moon, but instead, for seemingly no reason, he decided to not give them back willingly. He was already a scumbag for endangering them in the first place, but being willing to kill them for no reason after he'd already gotten what he wanted? Honestly, if nothing else, his dad should be proud. He raised one evil son of a shrink ray. We're close to the end of today's ranking, and it's time to talk about one of the most vicious villains in Illumination history, Bowser. Sure, his Nintendo counterpart is better known, but his Illumination iteration was surprisingly fantastic too, and Bowser's evilness in this iteration is really cranked up to 11 with the whole mass international terrorism shtick he's known for. I mean, his literal first act in the movie is invading a peaceful kingdom of penguins, kidnapping their leader, and taking all of their power for himself. Bowser is power hungry on a whole nother level. He's such a fun villain that it's easy to forget that his desire to conquer the world entails him forcefully taking over countless kingdoms, taking numerous people away from their homes, and potentially killing dozens more. Heck, forcing Peach to be his bride is a major plot point. Bowser's basically a dragon warlord who just happens to have the charisma of Jack Black. The darkest aspect of Bowser's takeover, however, comes in the form of his hostages. The aforementioned penguins are just one example, being dangled over a pit of lava for the crime of not surrendering to Bowser immediately, but, well, remember Luma Lee?
The only hope is the sweet relief of death.
Yeah, that weirdly cynical and nihilistic one. I was so busy laughing at his creepy dialogue in the movie that I didn't even think about the fact that Lumas are heavily implied to be baby stars in the Mario universe. Bowser basically kidnapped an infant from outer space and kept it so miserable that it ended up going completely insane, or he just kidnapped an already really messed up little kid, but like, it's not like that's any better. We're seriously hoping the sequel introduces Bowser Jr. to the ensemble cast, because this guy needs some reason to improve himself. In second place on the ranking of most evil Illumination villain deeds, we have the newest one from the studio, Maxime Le Mal, whose worst deed was infant abduction and experimentation. Ignoring the fact that Maxime held a grudge against Gru well into adulthood over something that happened back in high school, which only makes his actions even more petty, Maxime Le Mal is constantly shown to be a depraved criminal who will do anything to get revenge on Gru, or even just cause harm to others in general. In particular, in the movie's final act, Maxime decided to abduct Gru's youngest son, Gru Jr., in order to lure Gru out to have an epic final battle. Then, Maxime manages to do probably the only thing he could possibly do to make this deed even worse. He decides to mutate Gru Jr., who, may I reiterate, is a baby, into a half-cockroach hybrid, forcing him to nearly kill his own father. And all of this because of a high school talent show grudge. I don't know about you guys, but seeing this dude get absolutely trampled by that stampede of minions felt like a breath of fresh air. And you know, that wasn't even on purpose, but it is the perfect transition to the most evil deed committed by an Illumination villain. Mayor Aloysius O'Hare from the Lorax. His iconic determination to let it die, let it shrivel up and die, spells it out quite nicely. O'Hare's worst deed was creating a monopoly on oxygen. Remember that one SpongeBob episode where Mr. Krabs charged Squidward and SpongeBob for breathing?
Breathe on your own time. I don't pay you to breathe.
Yeah, O'Hare saw that and decided, hey, what if I did that IRL? And thus, O'Hare Air was born. By selling bottled air to his people to keep the air cleaner, he became a zillionaire. And by using his newfound power, wealth, and influence to keep anyone from leaving the town, he ensured that they would never discover the alternative to bottled air, that being planting trees. O'Hare is far from the most intimidating villain we talked about today, but he's an effective lesson in just how deadly ignorance can be. This guy kept the people ignorant of the wealth of natural resources that have been taken away from them, blatantly sabotaged by O'Hare himself, all to keep his pockets loaded with cash. Call me crazy, but I can't help but feel like he has enough to stop destroying the environment. Therefore, we crown O'Hare as the man with the most evil deed out of all of Illumination's villains. And further still, we encourage the jury to let him fry, let him fry. Put him on that chair and say bye. Or at least make him refund the 100 bottles of air we bought last week. That works too.